Well, today is a momentous and historic day in American history. I guess that's a bit redundant, saying it's a historic day in history. Uh, but, it's true. The U.S. has finally vacated the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan and has handed it over to the so-called Afghan government, also known as the Kabul regime, which the U.S. has backed since overthrowing the Taliban back in 2001. It is surely to only be in their hands for a limited time. The Kabul government is very weak and has never been very legitimate. It is almost certain to go the way of the Soviet-backed government in Kabul, which pretty much just disappeared and faded away into the ether, much like the German Democratic Republic, after the Soviets withdrew their affirmative support and pulled the troops out of that country. And so it's quite ironic that Bagram originally was a Soviet airstrip that the Americans took over, and sort of made the main base of their operations in Afghanistan. And now, just like the Soviets, they are abandoning that airstrip and now broader base that the Americans built up there, only to see all of their efforts in Afghanistan go to waste. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the U.S. should continue to stay. It was inevitable that this day would come eventually. I just thought that it would come in a fashion more similar to the Soviets, that the Soviets didn't pull out of Afghanistan until they were already crumbling. And who knows? Maybe in hindsight, we'll look back on this day and know that the American empire had already begun to crumble. I doubt that at this point. I'm pretty black-pilled on that issue after the way that the U.S. was able to weather COVID financially, though that's another story. But leaving Bagram, it's a big deal. It shows to me that the U.S. is serious about changing its role in Afghanistan. I think that the U.S. is going back to the way that of the days of the late 70s or in 1980s, in which U.S. operations in Afghanistan were much more covert rather than overt. Supposedly, the United States is going to leave behind 650 to 1,000 troops in order to quote-unquote guard the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. I highly doubt that that's going to be the limit on their actions, but nevertheless, an overt or a covert U.S. approach to Afghanistan is preferable to the overt war that they have engaged in for the past 20 years. Because again, we had about 20 years plus of covert action by the United States in Afghanistan before this 20 years of overt military action. And that covert action, again, it was bad too. The U.S. helped fuel the Afghan-Soviet War, and it fueled the Afghan Civil War. The U.S. Played a big role in putting the Taliban in power to begin with. And so who knows what pernicious ends the U.S. will be working towards in this new post-Afghan war era. Because it's hard for me to say whether or not this will lead to less death and destruction. It's hard to say how much better things are going to get. Again, I'm glad it's over. I don't want the U.S. troops to stay. But I think that the U.S. is going to do its damnedest to keep the war going, again, through more covert action. But if the war continues, the longer the war continues, the more people are going to keep dying, just like they have been over the past 20 years. I guess you could say, well, ordinary American soldiers are not going to be doing, as much fighting, so therefore they won't die. But, American soldiers make up for a small fraction of the casualties in Afghanistan over the war of the past 20 years. And so the closing of Bagram, or rather not the closing of Bagram, but the transfer of the control of Bagram Air Force Base from the U.S. to the Kabul puppet government might be a Pyrrhic victory for the anti-war movement, because again, I don't see this as a sign that necessarily hostilities will be halted. This is not. This isn't like when the U.S. left Vietnam where literally every last American was getting out, and you saw that last helicopter, people clinging onto it for dear life, saying, please don't leave us behind, which was really sad to see, but it was better than the continuation of a failed war in Vietnam. And now fast forward, 50 years on, and yes, Vietnam is still controlled by the Communist Party. I wouldn't want to live there, but at least Vietnam is not a war-torn country. They have an advancing economy. They are continuing to grow and to manufacture goods for the rest of the world. And so I'd much rather be born into Vietnam today than Afghanistan. But Afghanistan has no chance of ending up like Vietnam, as I see it right now. And again, you could not necessarily bet on peace in Afghanistan, even if the U.S. completely, washed their hands of the situation and got out. There's still plenty of warring factions in the country. We can hope that eventually one faction would win out and would dominate the rest to the extent that there would be a form of peace. But if the U.S. is involved, even that slim chance of Afghanistan eventually settling down and in entering an era of peace is gone, because the U.S. is going to work to affect further conflict, not to affect further peace. So I'm surprised as I think through. I don't do notes or scripts or anything like that. I just try and, I put a topic in my mind and I think out loud about it. And I'm surprised at myself to think how conflicted I am over this news. I thought that when this day, if this day ever came, which I didn't think it would, I thought that I would be happier than I am now. But I can't bring myself really to be happy. I guess from a public relations standpoint, I think it's good as an American, because I can point this out to people and say, hey, look, America's leaving Afghanistan. That's a good thing. But I know in my heart of hearts that it's not that simple. Because even if the U.S. military is less of a threat now in this situation than it used to be, you have to worry less about American soldiers, kicking in doors and, spraying bullets into a family's, dinner while they're just sitting down at 6 o'clock or something like that. They still will have to worry about the few special operations forces. They'll have to worry about the intelligence community and whatever mischief the CIA is up to there. And of course, the CIA's history in Afghanistan goes back to the 1970s. It is over 40 years at this point that the CIA has been operating actively in that country and stirring up trouble. I feel like you really, you can't have much of a peace when it comes to any of these American wars without completely excising the intelligence community and the spooks. And I really wish, who knows, maybe all of the domestic mischief that the intelligence community is getting into stirring up now maybe will lead to more of an interest in abolishing these ghoulish agencies. Because the national security state is an existential threat to Americans and foreigners alike, particularly Afghans. But only us Americans have any power, and I hesitate to use that term, but any influence over the existence of these agencies. And again, even we don't get a vote on that. Nobody asks us, hey, you okay with the CIA doing this? But at least being here directly in the United States, we do have more of an ability to influence the regime than people living in Afghanistan certainly do, because at least here in the United States there is this pretext that we are a democratic country. I've explained before that how that is, a fallacy, but it is still something that people believe in. And so therefore, if you present the general public with a compelling case as to why these agencies shouldn't exist, and there becomes a democratic grassroots groundswell of opposition to these ghouls, it should at the very least make their lives a little more a little more difficult. There should be some opposition to these folks and to the military. But again, it's harder to agitate against the military because, there's a lot more of them. A lot of people, they know veterans and things. They say, well, my dad was in the army. The army can't do anything bad. But I think that perhaps trying to target the spooks could be something a little more reasonable. It's a more effective goal. Because again, you can attack the wars. We've gotten to the point to where, at least on the right, you can criticize the wars. You're not criticizing the troops, because that's still taboo in this country. But you can criticize the wars themselves, and increasingly, I think we're able to criticize the spooks. And so, if you could, again, inject into the popular conversation, to the cultural zeitgeist, a tendency to be skeptical of wars and of the intelligence community, there would be a chance for things to improve here in America and throughout the rest of the world. I mean, I think of all the poor countries who are still having to live under the boot of the national security state, whether that be Somalia, Yemen, Syria, and my heart really aches for those people. And I can't help but try and think, even if it's in vain, of some way that I, as an American, since I do have, even if it's only marginal influence, I have more influence over Washington and over this country than anyone in any of those countries do. They don't even speak English, most of them. Actually, in Somalia, I think a lot of people do speak English. I believe that there was a majority of Somalia, what is today Somalia, was a British protectorate for quite some time, so I think English has become a sort of lingua franca there. So I don't really have anywhere happy to end this off, but I think I've made my point. It's always an ongoing discussion, is the way I treat this channel. I don't have some narrative that I've worked out ahead of time. I think through these things day by day, and I develop my thoughts, and I appreciate anyone who comes along for the ride.